Everyone knows how to laugh at a man who plants trees he will never see grow. In the Sierra, they laughed at him for years. They called it stubbornness. They called it an old man's madness. They called it throwing good water onto dry ground. Rarely does anyone stop to think that a man like that, perhaps, is not planting for himself. Aurelio Mendoza kept planting anyway, through every laugh, and it cost him 12 winters to be proven right. That October dawn, before the sun rose behind the hills, Don Aurelio stepped out onto the porch of his cabin with a bucket of water, and one by one watered the scrawny oaks that ringed his house, while the first north wind bit at his cracked hands. If you believe that what is sown with love is never wholly lost, stay and hear this story to the end. Subscribe to Tales of the Old Country and hit the bell, because here the stories of the mountain are told the way they were told before, beside the firelight. 12 years earlier, Aurelio did not plant trees. 12 years earlier, he had Rosa, and with Rosa he had everything a man could want in that lost corner of the Sierra of Durango. It was she who, already ill, lying on the cot by the window, asked him to ring the cabin with trees. Plant them in a circle, Aurelio, close together, like a wall, she told him one afternoon, her voice faint and her cold hand between his. He thought it was the delirium of the fever, and he went along with it, first to please her, then so as not to leave her alone in the idea. Rosa faded the way a good candle fades, without complaint, and she slipped away one January dawn with the night frost still clinging to the window panes. They buried her in the town cemetery under a sky gone white with cold, and it seemed to Aurelio that they buried half of himself along with her. The morning after the burial, when the earth over the grave was still fresh and turned, Genaro Palomares came up the dirt road with 2 farmhands and a mule. Genaro was the most well-off man on that side of the mountain. He had felled every last tree on his own land to open pasture, and he flaunted his fat cattle the way another man flaunts a family name. He stopped at the gate, looked at the first shoots Aurelio had planted the evening before, with hands still dirty from the grave, and laughed a fat laugh that echoed in the silence of the hill. He pulled some coins from his pouch and counted them out slowly on the fence post, one on top of another, so they would rattle, and said, "A man on his own doesn't need a forest. Mendoza, he needs money. I'll send the boys, we'll pull up those useless sticks for firewood, and I'll take the eyesore off your hands. Sign here, and we'll say no more about it." Father Genovevo, who had come up to sit with him in his grief, heard it all from the cabin door and lowered his eyes, ashamed of his own people. 2 boys out gathering firewood stood there, watching. Aurelio did not sign. He did not say a single word. He walked over slowly, gathered the coins off the post one by one, and returned them to Genaro's open hand, without anger, almost with pity, closed the gate, and went into his house. That night he sat beside the dead fire, with Rosa's shawl across his knees, still smelling of her, and for the first time in his life he did not know what he had been left alive for. The years passed the way they pass in the Sierra, without noise and without hurry. Aurelio did not go down to the town again, except for what he could not do without: a little salt, a little lard, a candle for Rosa's small altar. And each time he went down he heard the same thing behind his back: "There goes the tree madman, the widower who talks to the mountain." The boys shouted at him from a distance, and the women crossed themselves, more out of pity than fear. But he would go back up to his hill and carry on with his work. He dug, he watered with water hauled from the well. He splinted the crooked trunks with sticks and cord. He defended the shoots from the goats and the frosts by covering them with sacks at night. At first the oaks barely reached his knee. In time they passed his shoulder, and one ordinary day, without his knowing when it had happened, he had to lift his face to see their crowns. To the oaks he added some cypress. He transplanted himself from the ravine, and the circle closed in, green and stubborn, around the cabin. Every evening, as the sun went down, he lit a kerosene lantern and hung it from the eave, on the same nail where Rosa used to hang hers when she waited for him to come back from the mountain, so the light could be seen from the road. He didn't quite know who he was putting it out for. He put it out, and that was all. It was his way of not letting the night fall completely. It was one late October evening, 12 winters later, when a poor cart got stuck in the mud of the dirt road, right in front of his gate, as the sky slammed shut with the first icy rains of the north. Aurelio came out with the lantern in his hand. In the cart was a young woman, Catalina, with a soaked shawl and 2 little ones hidden beneath it, shivering. They had come from lower down the Sierra, fleeing a bad year and a house that was no longer theirs, looking for relatives in a town 2 days' journey away. The storm had caught them too soon. Aurelio asked no names and no reasons. He unhitched the mule himself, which was trembling with cold, gathered the smallest child into his arms. She was burning with fever, and pointed them to the door with no further ceremony. What Don Aurelio did not yet know was that that winter, the one already coming down through the ravines, would be the hardest the Sierra had known in 50 years, and that his humble cabin would be the only thing left standing on the whole hillside. Inside, he stoked the fire until the house grew warm, heated pot coffee with raw sugar and cinnamon, and pulled from the trunk the wool blankets that had lain folded and unused for 12 years. The children fell asleep before finishing their warm milk, one on each side of the fire, on the same reed mat. Catalina sat staring at the flames, her hands still purple, without the strength even to cry, and managed only a thank you that broke in her throat. The next morning it was raining steadily, and there was no way the cart could move over the ruined road. Catalina tried to apologize, to offer to work, to leave the moment it cleared so as not to be a burden. Don Aurelio poured her another cup of coffee and told her that in his house no one left with an empty stomach or wet clothes, and that if God had willed that mule to get stuck right in front of his gate, there must be a reason. That a man doesn't always understand his reasons in time. And so, without agreeing to it, without saying it, a routine began. Before dawn, while it was still dark and the cold of the Sierra cut to the bone, Aurelio would go out to the porch to water and check his trees one by one, like a man calling the roll. Little by little, Catalina began to take part in that habit. The first day she watched him from the doorway, wrapped in her shawl. By the third day she was already handing him the full bucket. One dawn she gathered her courage, caught up with him among the trunks, and asked him why he talked to the trees, whether he wasn't ashamed in front of the children. Aurelio ran his hand over the rough bark of the oldest one, the first he had planted with Rosa, and answered without turning, "These are the sentinels. We planted them to guard the house the day I no longer could. You talk to them because, when all's said and done, they're the only thing I have left of her." Catalina thought it was just the way of a lonely widower, and said nothing. But from that morning on, she too began to greet them under her breath as she passed. The sentinels were by now a closed ring of oaks and cypress, so dense that inside almost no wind got through, and in the evenings it hummed in the crowns as if the mountain were breathing. The oldest, the one Aurelio called the first sentinel, had a trunk as thick as a man's body and one low, nearly horizontal branch where Rosa had once hung a rope hammock. It didn't take the children long to find that branch and to fight over it. They began to play among the trunks, to hide, to give each tree a name, and the house filled with a sound of laughter it had not held for 12 years. Catalina swept the porch, mended by the light of the lantern, kneaded and cooked tortillas on the griddle as if that hearth had been hers all her life. The older boy helped carry firewood and water the hens, the little girl, well again now, followed Don Aurelio everywhere like his shadow. And he, who believed his heart had hardened like an old root, caught himself secretly saving her the best piece of tortilla or the largest bit of goat cheese. Every evening, without fail, he lit the lantern and hung it from the eave, and now the little girl reached up her arms for him to lift her and watch it kindle up close, and he would raise her with a pretended grumble that fooled no one. Not everything was quiet, for in the Sierra the tongue flies faster than the wind. One morning, a muleteer coming down the road with sacks of corn saw the smoke from the cabin and the woman hanging children's clothes among the trees. And the news rolled down the hill to the town, the way news that ought not to always rolls. It soon reached Gennaro Palomares, who let out an ugly laugh in the middle of the plaza and said, loudly, so all would hear him by the church, so a kept woman has latched onto the tree madman. It's only a matter of time before she strips him of the little he has, and the old man ends up on the street, the way he should have from the start. No one contradicted him. In the Sierra respect is inherited with the cattle, and Gennaros were many, but there was kindness too, as there always is. Doa Cleophas, an old woman from the neighboring ranch, came up one afternoon with a basket of fresh eggs, a bundle of herbs for the children's cough, and a laying hen so the girl can get by, and stayed a while drinking coffee without asking questions, for she knew what it is to be left alone on the mountain. Up above, deaf to the gossip, Catalina broke down one night beside the fire, once the children were asleep. She told Don Aurelio about the husband who had gone off after another life, about the house auctioned away over debts that weren't hers, about the closed-in fear of having nowhere to fall with her children when the worst of winter struck. She wept as she had not wept in months, with her whole body. Aurelio did not tell her not to cry, nor that everything would be fine. He waited for her to finish, handed her the dry shawl that had been Rosa's, and said only, "There's roof enough here, child, roof that's neither asked for nor paid for. God willing, we'll get through this winter hole." The next day, Catalina woke different, her back straighter, as if something heavy she had been carrying on her feet had finally settled into its place. But that very afternoon, while the little girl was looking for somewhere to hide, Don Aurelio was about to open at last the little cedar box that Rosa had left him, and to read, 12 years too late, something that had been waiting for him all that time in the darkness of the loft. It was the little girl who found it. Climbing where she shouldn't, up among the loft beams, she brought down a little cedar box coated in dust, with Rosa's initials carved into the lid with a knife, and carried it to Aurelio thinking it was a hidden toy. The old man recognized it the moment it was in his hands, and his pulse gave way. He had put it away the very day of the burial, with no heart to open it, and afterward time had covered it over with other things, and with that forgetting a man manufactures for himself so as not to hurt too much. He set it on the table and sat a long while, not daring to lift the lid. Inside were a rosary of seeds, a lock of hair wrapped in an embroidered handkerchief, and a letter folded in 4, yellowed with the years, with a date written in the corner in a trembling hand, January, the same month Rosa had gone. Aurelio never learned to read fluently. His voice shook as he asked Catalina to read it aloud. The letter was from Rosa. She had dictated it to the town schoolteacher in her last days, because her hand could no longer manage the pen, and that was why at the bottom there was also the teacher's signature as witness, and Father Genovevo's. It told him that she knew she was leaving, that he must not be afraid of being left alone, and that this, and not the whim of a sick woman, was why she had asked him for the trees. "I didn't plant them for us, Aurelio," Catalina read, her voice slowing more and more. "I planted them for those who arrive with no roof the day the sky truly closes." This hill is nothing but north wind. You know that better than anyone. And some year a winter will come. I don't know when. That will carry off everything not sheltered. When that winter comes, you'll have a living wall around the house, and someone will knock at your door, cold. Open it, you stubborn old man. Don't you dare close it out of pride. That's what we planted them for. If God grants me that they grow, those trees will save more people than you and I ever knew in our lives. Catalina stayed with the letter in her hand, unable to read on, and turned to look through the window at the dense ring of trees that in that very moment was keeping them safe from the downpour, and then at her two children asleep on the mat. And she understood, with a shiver, the same thing Aurelio was understanding in that instant, that she and her children were, exactly, the people Rosa had been waiting for 12 years before ever meeting them. "It's you, Catalina," said the old man in a thread of a voice. "You're the one she knew would come." The silence grew heavy, the good kind. Aurelio rose slowly, went out onto the porch without a coat though the frost was falling, laid his open hand on the trunk of the first sentinel, and for the first time since the day of the burial, let the tears come, not out of grief, but out of something gentle and deep that looked a great deal like gratitude. Everything the whole town had called an old man's madness for 12 years had at last a name, and the name was Rosa, and the name was love sown ahead of time. He closed his eyes and understood something he had suspected for 12 years without daring to believe it, that he had not been left alive for nothing, that he had been posted there on guard, keeping a promise until the one who was meant to come would come. Winter arrived 3 weeks later, and it arrived just as Rosa had foretold in her letter. First came the north wind, roaring down through the ravines as it had not in 50 years, tearing off eaves and sending roofing sheets flying. Behind the wind came the snow, dense, stubborn, falling day and night without rest, burying corrals, flattening lean toes, leaving the plain a white and silent desert. Down in the town, the exposed adobe houses cracked with the frost, and some came down. Gennaro Palomares' bare pasture, the pride of so many years, without a single tree to break the edge of the air, became a death trap. His cattle piled up and froze against the barbed wire fences, and the roof of his granary collapsed all at once under the weight of the snow, burying the whole harvest. Up above, by contrast, inside the closed ring of the sentinels, the wind broke apart in the crowns and reached the cabin walls gentle, almost warm. The fire did not go out a single night, and every evening, stubborn as its owner, the lantern light stayed lit on the eve, seen from far off like the one fallen star in all that white darkness. It was that light that began to draw the lost. First came a family from the neighboring ranch, the children blue with cold and a newborn calf under one arm. Aurelio threw the door wide and made room for them by the fire. Then came 2 old people who could no longer reach the town. Then a young mother with her newborn pressed to her chest. Then the very muleteer who months before had spread the gossip down the hill, now with his hat in his hands. Don Aurelio asked none of them which side they had been on, or what they had said of him in the plaza. Catalina handed out pot coffee and blankets and settled each one wherever there was space. The children made room on the mat for those who arrived, and that cabin, which for 12 years had seemed too big for one lone man, turned out to have room to spare for everyone. And one dawn, the coldest of them all, when earth could no longer be told from sky, there came a knock at the door, almost without strength. Aurelio opened it. On the threshold, covered in snow from head to foot, his hat clenched in his hands and without a single head of cattle to boast of, stood Gennaro Palomares. Inside, a heavy silence fell. Everyone knew him. Father Genovavo, who had been sheltering in that cabin for 2 days, rose slowly to his feet and said, without raising his voice, but with firmness, what many were thinking. Look now who the wall of useless sticks has come to gather in. Gennaro did not answer. He could not. He lowered his face, that same face that 12 years earlier had counted coins on a fence post beside a fresh grave. Catalina drew her children close to her, looking at him hard, without forgiveness. Everyone waited to see what the old man would do, whether he would leave him out in the cold, as anyone would have had the right to do. Aurelio walked slowly to the door, stood a long moment facing the man who had humiliated him the day after he buried his wife, watched him shiver under the snow, and at last spoke, slow and clear, so it would be heard to the last corner of the house. These doors were never shut. Gennaro, it was you who wouldn't come in. And he stepped aside to let him pass. Gennaro came in stumbling, dropped to his knees beside the fire, and wept like a child, not covering his face, in front of the whole town that had once laughed with him. No one said anything. Aurelio laid a wool blanket over his trembling shoulders and served him, with his own hands, a mug of good hot coffee. There was no reproach, no old accounts, not a single word too many. Because what is sown out of love gives shade not for one alone. It gives shade, when the real cold comes, for all those who one day have nowhere to go. Aurelio went back to his bench beside the fire, felt his hands go still for the first time in many weeks, and breathed deep, with the house full of living people and his heart at last made whole. When winter finally gave way and the snow began to run down the ravines turned to water, on that whole hillside not a single soul had to be mourned for the cold. And in the entire town, everyone knew perfectly well why. Spring came, and with it a smell of waking earth, of warm firewood, of fresh bread that Catalina drew from the clay oven, while the children ran barefoot among the trunks of the sentinels, dressed now in new green and full of nests. The lantern stayed on its nail, unlit by day, kindled every evening out of habit and out of promise. And where they had once laughed to see him pass, now they came up from the town with hoes on their shoulders, whole families asking Don Aurelio for a few shoots, a word of advice, a handful of acorns, to ring their own houses too with a living wall before the next winter. Even Gennaro Palomares had oaks planted in his bare pasture, in silence, seeking no one out. For there are repentances that instead of being spoken are sown and watered every morning. One of those afternoons, the two of them sitting on the porch watching the children play, Catalina asked Don Aurelio whether he didn't grow tired of half the town coming to ask him for things. The old man looked a long while at the ring of trees, looked at his little girl hanging from the low branch where a hammock had once been, and answered low, almost to himself, "Rosa didn't plant for me, child. She planted for this day. God had you marked down long before I ever knew you. I only kept watch so the promise would arrive in time. Sometimes the most important things are sown long before anyone understands what for. They are planted blindly, out of love or out of faith, and the years go by with them looking like a waste, until someone's winter comes, and the thing everyone called madness turns out to be the only wall left standing. The world is quick to laugh at what it does not understand, but the earth returns. Sooner or later, every root entrusted to it. Have you ever done something that everyone around you called madness, and only in time did they understand that it was, in truth, love sown ahead of its time? If this story touched something in your heart, leave me a comment and tell me from what part of Mexico, or from wherever you're watching, you're with me tonight. Give it a like, subscribe to Tales of the Old Country, and hit the bell. And share it with someone who needs to remember that no seed planted with love is lost, however many years it takes to give shade. Thank you for staying with me to the end. Until the next story, from heart to heart. One winter changed everything, the laughter, the pride, the whole shape of that mountain. And they say in that part of the Sierra of Durango that even today, when the north wind blows fierce, the one light that will not surrender on the whole hillside is an old lantern hung from the eave of a cabin, ringed by trees they once called madness, and now, hat in hand, call the sentinels.